Happy is a trivial emotion.
Yeah, happy.
And the fact that we're obsessed with happiness, even on the psychological side, is an indication of how trivial our culture is. I mean, one of the things that you see quite consistently in psychological research is that couples without children are happier than couples with children. It's like, well, you shouldn't have children. It's like, no, you shouldn't use happiness measurements as your index of outcome. But happiness is a fleeting hedonic emotion, and it's not an indicator of participation in a process that's going to stabilize your life and the life of your family.
We have to establish the definition of happiness.
Right.
So when we disagree over what makes us happy, unfortunately, the problem is even more fundamental. We don't even agree on what happiness is.
You can tolerate a lot of pain even if your relationships are intact and you're moving towards a purpose that you regard as worthwhile. So one of the things that's worthwhile to understand purely from the perspective of the psychophysiology of happiness is that the positive emotion that's produced by drugs like cocaine, for example, which make you happy, that positive emotion is always experienced in relationship to a goal, right? So that the happiness that people strive towards is only possible psychopharmacologically if you observe yourself moving towards a valued goal. And so that has a number of implications, one of which is no goal, no happiness, right? Or maybe happiness of only the most fleeting and easily substituted kind. We also know from animal research, for example, that it's very easy to get rats that are isolated in a cage addicted to cocaine. And you can get them addicted rapidly to the point where they will basically not drink water or eat or engage in sex. They'll just push a button to get cocaine until they die. But if they're living in their wild habitat, doing like normative rat things, it's almost impossible to get them addicted to cocaine. And so even at the purely level of pure pharmacological reward, if you have animals in a habitat where they're pursuing their intrinsic biologically determined goals, then they're participating in processes that make them very resistant to alternative forms of fleeting happiness. And we've blown that all apart in our society. And we don't know how much that's enraging. I really think it's enraging young women in particular. We have absolute, so we know that, for example, half of women who are 30 and under now don't have children. Half of them.
Wow.
Right, that we hit that milestone last year in the West. Half of them will never have children. That's the prognostication. 95% of them will regret that. So we're already in a situation where we have doomed 1 woman in 4 to permanent isolation and alienation. And we have no idea how angry they are about that. Yeah. But like you can be sure that they're angry at a level that's so deep that you can barely comprehend it.
I don't get any sense of joy out of drinking booze or going to loud clubs.
Having a good time is not your idea of having a good time.
That's right. That is exactly right. To me, having a good time is being about my purpose. Yeah. That's the source.
Well,
and that's why having children has increased my happiness.
Well, you both alluded to something that's fundamentally important on the measurement side, too. It's like almost all the things that people do in their life that they look back on with, let's say, self-assurance and something approximating reasonable pride are things they accomplished under difficult circumstances. Now, those aren't necessarily the things you pick for your hedonic pleasure. But when you look back, you think, well, that was extremely difficult and demanding and challenging, and there was a fair bit of suffering moment to moment while I was going through it. But man, I'm certainly more than pleased that I managed it.
Sometimes when you go to a movie and you watch a character dies and you cry, and then you come out and people say, how was the movie? And you say, it was great.
Yeah.
You know? And I think that life is kind of like that a lot of times, if you're paying attention.
Yeah, I think of happiness as if you're doing the things that you ought to be doing, then you're happy, sort of regardless of how you may feel in any given moment while you're doing that thing. And if you're doing the things that you ought not be doing, then you're in despair, regardless of how you feel in the moment. And when that question comes up, I think back to our first film, What is a Woman, when we went to Kenya to the Maasai tribe. And there's a lot of conversations we had with the tribesmen that didn't make it into film. But I remember multiple times when we were talking to especially the women, and I would ask them, are you happy? And every single time they would respond by saying, through the translator, they would respond by telling me about the things that they do. They say, well, I'm taking care of my family. I have a family. I have children. I take care of the home. That wasn't even the question. I said, are you happy? And their immediate response is to talk about the things that they do.
I'm performing my appropriate
because to them there's no the idea that they could be doing the things that they ought to be doing and not be happy. It's like, doesn't even make sense. It's a disconnect.
Well, that also indicates that in our society, we've abstracted the emotion away from its performative foundation. and we treat happiness as if it's an abstraction that exists in and of itself. And there's foolishness in that. And you also pointed to something else that's very interesting. When you ask people, it's very hard to ask people a question properly and get an answer that's reliable. It's very, very hard to do that. And psychologists have concentrated on doing that for decades. It's a whole field of endeavor. One of the things you discover if you do research into what people mean when they say that they just want to be happy is what they actually mean is they don't want to suffer. So you can imagine that there's two elements to happiness. One is not too much negative emotion, and the other is some positive emotion. And if you push people into a corner, they'll pick absence of negative emotion over presence of positive emotion every time, because pain is extraordinarily salient. And so part of what people mean when they say they want to be happy means is that they want to be secure in their foundation, which is not at all the same thing as pursuing the hedonic pleasure that would be duplicable, say, with cocaine.